Reconvene the group for the first of our afternoon programs. The first panel this afternoon will be on rethinking the role of zoos. And we have three speakers.
Okay.
Gregory Dennis, past president of the American Veterinary Medical Law Association.
What do you need?
Mr. Dennis has written or given more than 190 articles and or talks on veterinary law and animal law, both within and outside the United States. He's a charter member of the American Veterinary Medical Law Association, and he has served on 2 American Veterinary Medical Association task forces dealing with issues affecting the veterinary profession. In 2009, he co-authored the chapter on veterinary malpractice law for the American Bar Association's Litigating Animal Law Disputes, a complete guide for lawyers. We also have Sheriff Matt Lutz from Muskingum County. For 20 years, Sheriff Lutz has protected the citizens of Muskingum County, Ohio. And he joined the police force in 1989, and he also has held positions in the Corrections Division and the Road Division before being promoted to the rank of Patrol Lieutenant in 1998. He is going to speak about his experiences in the situation that occurred in Ohio relative to the privately owned zoo. Will Travers is our final speaker on this panel. He's the Chief Executive Officer of the Born Free Foundation. He has dedicated most of his life to wildlife issues, growing up in Kenya while his parents made the movie Born Free. Since 1996, he has been president of the Species Survival Network. He is also a fellow of the Royal Geographic Society, a founding member of the Captive Wild Animals Protection Coalition, and a member of the IUCN Species Survival Commission Reintroduction Specialist Group. He has personally been involved in rescuing dolphins, tigers, lions, and elephants. So thank you all for being here.
My name is Gregory Dennis. I'm an attorney. I've been practicing law for 30 years, 28 of those in representation of veterinarians. I do not sue veterinarians. Only time I sue veterinarians is representing one vet against another. Just have a couple of questions here so I can get the feel of the audience. How many of you here are law students here at DePaul? Come on, be proud. It's a good law school. Okay. Do we have any veterinarians? Do we have any registered veterinary technicians? Anyone who's ever worked at a veterinary practice? We've got one. Good on you. Have anyone who's ever worked at a zoo? High school summer job, anything like that? Okay. Is anyone willing to own up to having a family member who's a veterinarian? There we go. Must be some interesting arguments at Thanksgiving time. I have, over the years, represented and advised zoo veterinarians with regards to law and regulations that pertain to them in rendering veterinary medical services in zoo practices. The predominant law or body of regulation comes from the USDA Animal Plant and Health Inspection Service. But there are some other laws that can come into play, such as federal drug laws, federal controlled substance laws, the state companion laws on those matters. Needless to say, and this is just out of a book that just got published this summer, Fowler's Zoo and Wild Animal Medicine. It's a standard text. This is the most recent edition. And I think you'd all agree with this. Media has found interest in animal deaths at zoos. Suddenly, some zoos found the media inquiring about every zoo animal death, almost as if every animal death might be considered suspicious. Based upon my representation of zoo veterinarians, I agree with that. It's in a sense in the public that somehow animals aren't supposed to die. This is from a deposition I took earlier this year of a zoo director. Okay, given your experience as a zoo director, is it publicly popular to euthanize a zoo animal? Look at the answer. No, it never is. And then further, they referring to the public, usually expect animals to live forever. Now we know as a biological scientific fact that that is not true. But unfortunately, the public expects it, as though somehow there's an exception when it comes to zoo animals. I want to take this case that I handled as a case example. But I'm going to go through a few of the press reports. And when you get the press reports, you think, wow, this must have been one incompetent of a boob of a zoo veterinarian. 4 deaths, a leopard, a hippopotamus, a lion cub, and an anteater. Happened within the last 3 years. Talking about dubious distinction. They then brought in State University. Actually, there were 2 board-certified American College of Zoological Medicine veterinarians they brought in, and to conduct an independent review of those cases. Now, one was a black leopard. This animal was geriatric, 16 years old, near death, and the veterinarian put it on a non-steroid anti-inflammatory drug, a drug known as carprofen. And wow, when that hit the press, you don't put cats on non-steroid anti-inflammatory drugs. You can put dogs on it, but you can't put cats on it. And they reported that kidney problems were usually caused by anti-inflammatory drugs. In other words, the vet, the incompetent boob, had killed the animal. These are from press reports. Another thing here it is again. Misspelled histopath report. Arthritic medication. The leopard had caused the fatal problems. Another one was the death of the 17-day-old lion cub. Fell from a 3-foot shelf onto a concrete floor. Actually, there was some hay on that floor. It died less than a day later from kidney problems, likely secondary to the fall. This is what's being reported in the media, being put out there. Even the media got more. Animals in the wild operate with stealth. To the same extent, the same can be said about the operation of the city zoo, like they're hiding things. Another one that came, which they threw the mud at the veterinarian on, and this was bad. This was really bad. 53-year-old hippopotamus they find in its hot water sauna, and the temperature is 108 degrees in the water. And you're thinking, wow, I mean, this veterinarian has just got to be absolutely, should be stripped of her license and shouldn't be allowed. Here's more of the coverage report. Damning federal inspection, lax veterinary care, inadequate record keeping. 2 animals died after being infested by maggots. Well, one of the things, first off, you learn with maggots is they, interestingly enough, also appear post-mortem. This animal's carcass was found approximately 8 hours after it was last seen live. Another thing, just from the human's standpoint, We now have gone back to using maggots in humans, for firebirds. Maggots eat dead tissue. They don't eat live tissue. We're actually using that, and we've been using it in medicine, in veterinary medicine also. So there is a reason going on. How many of you are familiar with the AZA? The Association of Zoos and Aquariums. Okay, the AZA is not the USDA. It is not a governmental regulatory authority. It's an organization which you have to be accredited to join. Somewhere in the neighborhood of around about 10% of the zoos in the United States are AZA members. They've passed the accreditation standard. This was one of the zoos in question, and it had also passed the AZA standards. At the time it was under USDA inspection. And there was a reason why the AZA was quiet, like a governmental agency is quiet, is while an investigation is going on, they don't comment. Here it is, alarmingly substandard veterinary care, inadequate record keeping, so forth and so forth. Good journalism abounds. You know, their good reporting had been so great that they had managed to get the zoo director and the head veterinarian effectively thrown out of their jobs. I mean, it's looking dark in Mudville right now. Well, this was the thing. It's not looking good for the veterinarian. First off, dealing with reporters, it's very clear. They do not understand veterinary medicine, and they do not want to take the time to learn veterinary medicine. They don't even want to take the time to go to a nearby veterinary library that's only 54 miles down the road and bother to look things up. Going through the paperwork, even if they're able to comprehend portions of the paperwork, the tendency, and this is not only this case, but in other ones, to cherry pick things out of there. And I'll use a very good example in a few moments. We have occurrence in this case of what is called off-label drug use, sometimes known as extra-label drug use. In the United States, we have very few drugs that are approved for animal use. We're worse than Canada, Australia, Great Britain, Europe on the number of drugs that we've got. We're down around about 23. Most of the drugs used in veterinary medicine in the United States is used off-label. What I mean by off-label is using it even though the manufacturer's insert makes no mention that the drug can be used that way. Classic example right now. If you've got a diabetic cat, the probabilities are it's getting human insulin. We used to have a feline insulin, but we had to pull it for trouble. So when the press heard about off-label drug use, their reaction was, well, it's drugs. It's got to be criminal. It's got to be illegal. Another thing which is a problem is it just seems like every layperson who has ever taken their dog or cat in to get it spayed or neutered or get a rabies vaccination automatically becomes a veterinary expert. This is actually taken from a blogger statement. I know my physician treated my child by. Excuse me? Your physician is also a veterinarian, and how he treated a child, the same principles apply on how you treat a hippopotamus or how you treat an elephant or a giraffe. This is the field you're dealing in. Let's go back to this write-up. Lion cub. Histopathologic examination revealed a severely dysplastic kidney. In other words, the kidney wasn't functioning. This animal was not going to survive. It was going to die. The review that was undertaken revealed that the veterinarian's management of the case was appropriate. during the arbitration hearing, it turned out that the best witness that the zoo veterinarian had on this point turned out to be the cub's mother. If you bothered to look at the records, you would have seen that the mother got up to the ledge on 2 occasions and smelled that cub. Neither time brought that animal down. The mother was able to detect that that animal wasn't going to survive. The second thing which was really interesting is, how do cats land when they fall? Do they land on their backs? Do they land on their butts? Do they land on their heads? They come down on their feet. 3-foot drop, actually when we got it measured it was about 3 foot 4-inch drop. This animal landed on its back. Couldn't even right itself. So when you got into supposedly the veterinarian having mishandled this, turned out the veterinarian had it. The experts reviewed it, even the zookeeper reports gave further evidence, and a severely dysplastic kidney, this animal wasn't going to survive, and in fact died as a result of having a non-functioning kidney. Another one which was brought up by the media and pounded upon was a Tanamou. But then the report came out. By the way, when the report came out from the experts, guess what didn't get into the newspapers? The report. So the veterinarian's left hanging out to dry in public, but the report doesn't get into the newspapers. You know, it's like that. It's even worse than where on the front page the press makes a big get it repaired. And then after the animal sustains injuries, does die, then it starts leaking out in the press what the zoo management had been up to. In point of fact, there were 2 hippopotamuses in that water. The veterinarian, my client, was able to save one of those 2. That didn't get mentioned. But for the one that died, the care that was undertaken, the medical records that reviewed, her treatment was appropriate. Now, going to the leopard. This was a 16-year-old. None of this got into the media. You basically face, in this situation, with a geriatric animal who's approaching the last days of life, you can do about 4 things. You can sit back and do nothing. Well, that's really not a good idea because the animal's in discomfort and pain. In veterinary medicine, we deal now with pain management. So doing nothing is not an option. The 4th option is euthanasia. Well, you saw the deposition transcript earlier that the public doesn't like that. Another option is put it on a narcotic, opiate drug. Well, that's really not a good option either. Because the problem with putting an animal on a narcotic opiate drug is, and I know this seems back to front to you, veterinary patients can't speak to their doctor. More so than in human medicine, clinical signs are important to a veterinarian in being able to evaluate the animal. You can't pick the cat up and say, oh, how are you feeling today? Oh, I've got loose bowels, got a temperature, feel nauseated in the stomach. You don't get that information. When you put an animal on a narcotic or opiate, you're masking those clinical signs of pain. When you can feel around the abdomen, when you can feel the joints, you lose that ability. So out of all of the choices, you're down to really using a non-steroid anti-inflammatory drug. Was it the greatest thing to do? No. But was it, out of all of the options you had, was it the best? Yes. And never mentioned by the press was, in fact, the dosage administered is what's right out of what we consider the Bible of veterinary pharmacology in the United States, Plum's Veterinary Drug Handbook. And there's actually two that are used in the United States, Plum's and another one is called Saunders. Just going to move through here a bit on some other things. This was from the university's report confirming that non-steroid anti-inflammatory drugs are commonly used in zoo animals, including large cats. If you want to read the article decision, there's the Westlaw citation. I admit the citation is a bit odd. The decision, in fact, came down in 2010. Westlaw didn't pick it up in 2011. So it appears with a 2011 citation. But there is the decision for you. And as I understand, the PowerPoint will be available to you. One of the things that happened in that Sioux veterinarian case, and here's a reflection of it in a case out of Cincinnati, the same thing happening. There were no problems with the veterinarian. No complaints, never written up or anything. And this veterinarian gets interviewed at the end of a regular routine USDA inspection. Standard question that the USDA asks, do you have enough funds for this year? You're all right. And the veterinarian said, truthfully, honestly, well, we're a bit short on cash, but we're making our way through. Well, a similar thing happened with the Cincinnati veterinarian. A few years before, he's interviewed by the USDA inspector, and when you get behind it, that's basically the same thing he said, was he was concerned with some of the treatment, and also the city had been cutting the budget. And that raises a red flag with the USDA, because then they're concerned about inadequate animal care being provided. One of the things in this case was there was an allegation that the veterinarian used expired drugs on the animals. Well, three things. One, not all animals at zoos are under USDA APHIS regulation. Matter of fact, the majority of them are what we call non-regulated animals. So the USDA APHIS regulations only apply to animals which are basically warm-blooded mammals, and that's where the authority kicks in when it comes to those. As to the other animals, they don't care. They assert no jurisdiction over them. Under Veterinary Care Policy number 3, they make it excruciatingly clear they don't assert any jurisdiction on the use of expired drugs on non-regulated animals. Now, in fact here, there was never ever evidence presented that the veterinarian had used expired drugs. And another thing was, which was incredible, was there was actually a written city policy that had been in place for 10 years at the time this incident happened that authorized the use of expired drugs. So here you are disciplining someone for following the very regulation that your own city has had in place for 10 years and the USDA has seen for the last 9 years without criticizing. One of the criticisms dealing with USDA inspectors is this, is inconsistency of inspections. You will have a USDA inspector come in, look at your facilities, have no problems, or might have a problem with something here or there, but not have a problem with this, only to be followed up a few weeks later or a few months later with another USDA inspector coming in and writing you up for this. And you kind of go, well, hold on here a second. Your colleague was just here last month. She didn't have any problems with this. Based upon my personal experience with USDA inspectors, I think they are good when it comes to inspecting dog breeding facilities, dog brokerage facilities, feline facilities. I think the cattle people are good. But I've got to tell you, when it comes to zoos, large animals, I am not impressed with their quality. In a case I tried earlier this year, I point blank asked the USDA inspector, do you have any experience working in a zoo? The answer was no. That's why I have more respect and I'm more impressed by an adverse AZA report, because those people are zoological veterinarians or they're zoo veterinarians. And it's a problem that you get into. The allegation here of lax record keeping, and I'll start wrapping up at this point. Yeah, there was a problem getting the records produced. About a month before the USDA came in, the city's information technology department, and some of you might have heard of MEDARCS, it's an antiquated DOS system. It's probably the only DOS system still left out there being used. They crashed it. They wiped out 25 months of zoo veterinary medical records. Gone. Now you imagine that happening to you. You come to work or you come to school and 25 months of your information is gone. Well, no problem. All we need to do is to go over to archives and just pull it out from archives and bring all the information over. Well, that was expecting too much of the information technology department, because when they went over to archives to pull the information over, it was empty. There was nothing there. It's a good thing you're sitting down. It turned out the information technology department 2 years before had forgotten to turn the archive file on. So who gets blamed? The people in the information technology? No, the veterinarian gets blamed. Fortunately, the veterinarian had kept all of the paper records and had to literally start entering 2 years plus of veterinary medical records, lab reports. Just gonna, this was from a press reporter. Do you feel like you were thrown under the bus? Veterinarian, under the tank, yes. Bloggers comment after this trial happened. When the decision came out, all you have proven to me is that the arbiter decision was clearly wrong. Didn't matter. Once all the information is out in the public domain, it didn't matter. Key points of legislation to be aware of under the Animal Welfare Act. It is really sections 2140 and 2143. Key regulation is 9 CFR 2.40. That is really the meat of the USDA's APHIS regulatory authority over attending veterinarians. Another one to be aware of is policy number 3, which is the guideline. As mentioned, amphibians, fish, and reptiles are outside. Avians are now starting to come under the USDA jurisdiction. And I'm just going to end with this one. Deaths and injuries, yeah, it does happen. And a matter of fact, a veterinarian at the New Zealand Zoo was killed. At the sanctuary in Tennessee, an elephant handler was killed. A few years ago, a vet got bit in Omaha. I didn't know about this, but I don't think the penguin was going to vote for him. That's all I can say. If you don't believe injuries happen to veterinarians, that is an actual photograph of what happened to a Taiwanese vet. They were actually able to reattach the arm. Surprised me. And here I'm going to end. This is what happens when you bring in a non-zoological veterinarian. This was the zoo thought that, you know, an ordinary small animal practitioner, dog and cat veterinarian, and I know him, he's a nice guy, he really is. He was out of his league here. That's him back there with blue shirt. But just look at all these people in the room. This zoo had an animal chute that they could have put this giraffe in and treated the animal. But, you know, it's not in a restraint chute. It's on an air mattress, which was actually a few minutes before taken out of the back of a pickup truck. They lay the giraffe down on that floor, which is, it's tile and then concrete beneath it. This giraffe, quote, baby giraffe, end quote, its height by this point was higher than the ceiling tiles. So if this animal had come up suddenly, its head would have gone through the ceiling tiles like these up here. Look at all these people in the room. What the hell are they doing there? And I don't know what the local TV cameraman's doing there. He's obviously not filming it, but what's he doing in the room? Another thing is, giraffes do kick and bite. So, yeah, that's something bad. So I will end with that photograph. And why don't you take over? And do you want to take questions now or at the end?
I think at the end.
Okay, why don't we do it that way then? Either way. Okay. Oh, either way. Okay.
Someone with technical skills to get
I'll look at my...
End show. I'm guessing somebody just tell me I'm doing the right
Yes.
thing. End show. Thank you. And then
Go to the top of the head.
I know mine is on here somewhere. Look, there it is. It's there. So just go to the top. Hello. That one. And you need the clicker? Yes, yes, here it is. Okay, this is going to be quite difficult to do because I have notes on my screen, but they're not on that screen, so you're going to look at this, and then I'm going to be looking down here, but I'm going to make it very, very easy for you, really, because I'm just going to whip through lots and lots of pictures, lots of pictures. So much easier. And I'm not a vet, I'm not a lawyer, and after Gary's presentation at lunchtime, I feel like I'm not an anything. It's wasted 28 years. Never mind. Okay, so I've been asked to consider rethinking the role of zoos in this particular instance, and I worked for and founded the Born Free Foundation in 1984. So I'm going to race through some pictures, and then maybe there'll be some time for questions. But anyway, as you now know, it was my parents were in the film Born Free, and then I'm going to show you pictures of animals being used in films, which of course I fully expect to be shot for now. This is an elephant. People think that Born Free, the foundation, began because of a lion. It didn't. It began because of an elephant. This elephant ended up at the London Zoo. She was caught from the wild in 1969. Went to the London Zoo despite the fact that my parents had negotiated for her to go back to the wild. But the authorities said they'd catch another elephant and give her to London Zoo. So Polly went to London Zoo. There she is in the film. She did have a nice time. It was done by love. There was no beating. But when she got to London Zoo, she was at least emotionally beaten, because this is the environment she lived in. This is a very famous elephant house designed by someone who has absolutely no clue about elephants, and she was psychologically damaged by that. The last year and a half of her time at the zoo, she was on her own, and all of you know that that is a swaying behavior, which indicates psychological distress. My parents hadn't seen her for 10 years. They were told that she was going to be destroyed, and so they went to see her and called her name. She reached out across the moat, and I think it's a poignant picture and tells me that elephants never forget. But then she died, and my mum wrote something about elephants, and I won't read it for you. You can read it for yourselves. A bit more time. So you might gather from that that we take a fairly strong line on zoos. So why do we spend so much time working on the zoo issue not to close them all down? And I'll come to that in a second. But we certainly expose the kind of suffering that goes on in zoos around the world. And I've probably seen, I don't know, 500 zoos in my time in 50 different countries. And unfortunately, what I saw when we started still continues today in large measure, notwithstanding the efforts of perhaps the federated zoos, the AZA, the European Association of Zoos and Aquaria, the BIAZA, the British and Irish Association of Zoos and Aquaria. It's not guaranteed that just because you're a federated zoo that you deliver higher standards, unfortunately. So I'm going to quickly talk to you about, this is where I look at my crib sheet here, and I find out that I'm going to talk to you about US laws and regulations, obviously. Zoo inspections in the UK, home turf, and zoos in Europe. Let's start with the US. Okay. If I'm wrong on this, then feel free to correct me at any time. My understanding is that under the Animal Welfare Act, it's a Class C licensee and exhibitor whose business involves showing, etc., and you have to meet certain criteria in order to get that license. And one of them is that you have to have facilities, under the Facilities and Operating Standards, structural strength. You have to have enclosures that meet structural strength criteria. However, hopefully this isn't a blank screen, there are some real doubts about whether that these criteria are met, these criteria are stuck to, that these criteria are adequate, because time after time people get hurt, and inevitably the animal also pays the price at the end of this process, because the animal is often then put down because it's dangerous, but then it's a dangerous wild animal, and that's why you have structural strength. Never mind, it's a tautology. So you also have to provide adequate space that is supposed to give the animal the ability to have normal posture, to move properly, and all these other criteria on here. Well, oh no, I'll go back on that space one. Well, you've all been to many zoos, and I have to just argue that I don't think that we even get close to providing many of the animals in those zoos with the kind of space that allows them to form natural behaviors, to socialize naturally, to live in correct social groups. And I'm going to use an example that I know Catherine's going to talk about in a different way later, but we were just a few months ago, we were in Los Angeles looking at the new exhibit for elephants at the Los Angeles Zoo. Has everybody read about this? Happy story. So the new exhibit, which has cost a staggering $42 million, and as someone who works in Africa a lot, I can only imagine what 10% of that would do for the conservation of elephants in Africa or Asia. Provides the 3 elephants that the zoo currently has, 1 male and 2 post-reproductive females, so there's not a lot of breeding going on, with 4 separate enclosures, the biggest of which is less than an acre, and the total space available to the elephants is 2.16 acres, I think I'm right in saying. an Asian male will have a home range of about 7,500 acres in the wild. A female Asian elephant will have a range of about 8,000 acres in the wild. We are deluding ourselves that we are providing our children or ourselves with some kind of meaningful educational experience, or the animals with some kind of meaningful living environment, if we think that by spending 42 million and delivering 2.16 acres, we've got the formula right. You're also supposed to look after animals in an appropriate way with regard to temperature. This was the old elephant house, I have to say, I think at the National Zoo. Well, this isn't an environment for Asian elephants. This isn't the kind of climate that Asian elephants would normally experience, and so what you have to do if you have an outside environment which you can't change, do so many, oh well actually maybe that's not true, another 1,000 years and we'll have heated up. We'll have heated up. But this is what you have to do. You have to put an elephant inside for 3, 4, 5 months of the year, and if you go to other places, you go to Toronto, you have to do the same. So this creates an environment where an animal like this develops those stereotypic behaviors, and we witness mental suffering. This is actually, just by contrast, the elephant transit home in Sri Lanka, which is partly sponsored by Born Free. These are orphaned elephants. They are looked after at the centre until they reach the age of about 4. These are 4-year-olds. This is a 1-year-old. This is my colleague Adam Roberts, who I went to Sri Lanka with. And then they go back to the wild. They are genuinely returned to the wild, into the many, many thousands of hectares. So it's actually really quite a large, it's about 500 square kilometre national park that they go into. In my view, again, it's not perfect, but unlike what Gary was saying, which sort of was, in a little bit, in my view, the sort of counsel of doom, because I couldn't see how we were going to get enough critical mass to get to the promised land. I think there's lots of individual journeys that we're all on, and for these animals, this is the best that we, imperfect humans, can do in our imperfect world. So another issue I'm going to quickly talk about is CITES, international trade in endangered species. I've worked on this since 1989. Talked earlier about inappropriate relationships between one animal and another. So here's a tigress with baby piglets dressed in little tiger jackets. And the reason that they do that, as you might imagine, is because she's a breeding machine. She has cubs, they take the cubs away. They put the piglets there to keep her lactating, and then they bring her back into cycle, and she produces litters in cubs in a far higher frequency than she normally would. And down here, you've got a tiger with long golden retriever. I think there's a pig here, and golden retrievers here, and so that's unusual. But of course, when I went here and took these photographs, the way that the zoo, the Sri Raja Tiger Zoo, described itself was happy world, we all live together. All barking mad, as I would put it. Anyway, they also have 450 tigers at this zoo. 450 tigers at this zoo. No other species, just 450 tigers. You can pet them, you can stroke them, you can feed them. They cycle them very fast, and then my guess, and it's a fairly educated one, is that they go out the door when they get to a certain age and they head off to China, where they're then recycled into some product that you probably wouldn't like to take. This was a safety issue. We actually opened the door, went in here, and Alan almost got clobbered by the tiger that took an interest in him. So what's this got to do with CITES? Well, CITES does have some animal welfare provisions in it, and those provisions relate to whether the animal is used in a commercial environment or not a commercial environment, and unfortunately zoos are not regarded under CITES as commercial operations, they're regarded as non-commercial operations. So this is the list of non-commercial. So you can bring animals in from the wild. People don't think that animals are still brought in from the wild, but they are. Namibia just now shipped elephants to Chile, elephants to Mexico, and it's caught 140 animals, cheetah, lion, elephants, you name it, and sent them to the National Zoo in Cuba. I can provide this text. I don't need to go through it all, but it does provide some protections, but this is the acceptable and appropriate destination for an elephant, not the LA Zoo or anywhere else, actually. Even the rescue centers, the Tennessee Elephant Sanctuary, Patton Ed's place in California, they know that they are absolutely the best that they can do, but they know that they're not the right place for elephants. They'll admit it. Okay, what have I got? Oh, the quick Swaziland story. So Swaziland had a massive elephant population, 39, all of which came from cull victims they were the orphans of a cull in South Africa. They were brought in, some died, some survived, some bred, some didn't, and the population of 39 is exactly the same number that they imported. So it didn't go up or down, but they suddenly decided that they had too many, even though they were in tens of thousands of acres. They said it was competition for land use. Actually, I think it was that elephants were knocking down trees that vultures lived in. So they sent them to the San Diego Wild Animal Park. The San Diego Wild Animal Park sent its elephants away from the park to make space for these ones coming in, and I think 2 of them came to the Brookfield and then died. And the transaction was $132,000. You'd have thought that was commercial, but it's not, because it's not the money that you give a country for the animals that's counted as commercial, it's what you do with them when you receive them. And because you receive them and put them in a zoo, which is non-commercial, it's not a commercial transaction. There was incorrect information on the import permits, and they had been misrepresented in terms of the data, but this is what the guy in Swaziland said to the judge, which compelled the judge to make a decision that they should come in regardless of all the legalities. We took a lawsuit on this. He says, I'd reserve refrigerator space and that would be a shame, sort of thing. And this is where they've gone. If you haven't been, it's about 2 acres, 2 and a little bit. It's got trees around the back, but the elephants can't get to the trees. So, quickly moving on, because I know time's short. This is now my other 2 quick things. The first is we've just completed, and it's in your binders, an assessment of animal welfare in British zoos by government-appointed inspectors. Pretty poor result, quite honestly. We've had the most modern piece of zoo legislation in the world since 1984. Oh, 94, 2004, yeah, nearly 30 years. And we are still finding situations where our findings are that 3/4 of the zoos do not meet all the welfare requirements. There we go. Now I'm talking about the EU, taking on this whirlwind tour of most of the planet. The EU, and I wanted to show you, you can download all this. My very small team of 2 went off to 20 countries and visited 200 zoos, 20,000 enclosures, and their report that they've produced was an evaluation of the implementation of this directive. All zoos in the European Union are supposed to be licensed and are supposed to meet minimum standards, and that's the definition of a zoo. And that's what it would then encompass. Anything that's open for 7 or more days a year, regardless of whether you pay, it's open to the public 7 or more days a year and has these criteria, then it's a zoo. So we went to 20. We couldn't actually afford to go to all 27, but we went to 20 of the countries, and we looked at the 200 zoos, and we wrote reports on each one. Each report, 40 pages long. I'll just pull these up here. The directive was a framework. It was supposed to strengthen the role of zoos in the conservation of biodiversity, exchange of information, adequate accommodation for the animals, biological needs being met, ensure that they're provided with species-specific enrichment, high standards of husbandry, curative veterinary protocols, and unfortunately, it didn't really happen. And this all got a little bit difficult to see, I think, because it's a certain colour and then there's a background to it. I'll send all this through. But we found a raft of problems. Zoos operating without licenses, veterinarians with no experience of exotics, so that, you know, dog and cat veterinarians trying their best often with no training to deal with animals in zoos, public safety issues, public health issues, lack of inspection training, so even the inspectors didn't know what they were looking for, and that's pretty hopeless. So our objectives were to review it, to assess it, to see what the status of it was, to look at the reasons behind the inconsistencies, and ultimately, as a person who would like there to be no zoos, nevertheless, working within the real world, I know that the best we can do in the medium term is to make sure that animals in zoos benefit from the legal safeguards they're entitled to. So we reviewed the legislation, we've given it all to the member states. Daniel and I go to Brussels on a regular basis and make presentations to the European Commission, to the European MEPs, members of the European Parliament. And they are at last beginning to move, because there's a new thing in Europe. They say no more legislation, let's do the right thing with the legislation we've got, which actually works in our favour. These are, well, I hope it won't take, there we go, that's quicker. All right, so those are the countries we went to. In the large countries like France, Germany, the UK, down to maybe 3 zoos in, I don't know, Portugal, and I think there was only 1 zoo in Malta. And then we came up with a whole series of recommendations that required immediate attention. That's training at every level, dealing with incompetency, making sure that zoos don't self-regulate, and then other requirements that we also put forward, recommendations that we also put forward, often to do with welfare. Quickly looking at this, what could this be all about? Oh yes, I'll make it back. This is me saying to you that we'd like to do more on this issue here in the States. We have the AZA. My confidence levels in the AZA's ability to regulate its own membership, let alone to be an engine for change in the wider zoo community, is not great. For various reasons, I haven't got time to go into them all now. But the veterinary profession here, some great, and some not so great. Zoo conditions, everything from roadside menageries that get a USDA license. Remember that the AZA is only, what, about 270 institutions, and the 2,700 licensed public display facilities. So the AZA is only 10% of what's out there. But we need yourselves, we need the public to look at what's going on, to give us the kind of feedback that will channel our limited resources in the most effective way to bring it to the attention of legislators, whether at a state level, federal level, city, municipal level, to deliver improvements, because where I do agree with much of what was said this morning by everyone is that to stand back and do nothing is not an option. Whether we can get to where we want to go in a reasonable period of time, maybe not. But I can't have animals suffering in zoos just because nobody's doing anything about it. And incremental change is important. Adam told me a story about this, so now I'm going to tell you the story, and this is the last slide. So let's just quickly get to it. He said, so he took his daughter to the National Zoo, this was a few years ago, as part of his work, and he wanted to look at the old Asian house, which has an elephant from Sri Lanka, and Mia, his daughter, who was then 3 years old, couldn't understand why the elephant was standing alone in such a small room eating hay. Is it because it's cold outside, she asked. And then she saw the hippo, and she said, why is that hippo all alone? Why does he have to play with that red ball? Where are his friends? And even at the age of 3, that little girl kind of got it, that what we were doing in terms of the animals and what we were delivering in terms of education and what we weren't delivering in terms of conservation did not add up to a pile of beans. and if a 3-year-old can get it, then surely we must. So, I think that's the end of my slideshow. How's that? Oh, now I need to just end slideshow, click, exit, click to end.
Good afternoon. How is everybody? I got a little nervous when Brett told me that we were going to be talking after lunch because I've been through a lot of conferences where you go after lunch and it's not very exciting and your belly's full and you sit back and fall asleep. So, but I knew having these two guys here today would keep us interested. So my presentation usually goes 45 minutes to an hour. So I'm going to go kind of very quick, hit some hot topics that I'm going to address, and then we'll open it up for questions because I'm sure you'll have some. But getting right into me, I want to first say that when I seen the topic about zoos, that was a lot of miscommunication about our incident. How many remember seeing our incident in Muskingum County, Ohio? Okay. There was a lot of criticism put out to us because I think people thought we were dealing with a zoo. We weren't dealing with anything close to a zoo except for the number of animals that we had. This was private property ownership, a private property farm where an individual in our county in the state of Ohio had been allowed to accumulate 56 exotic animals because of a lack of Ohio regulations and federal regulations. And that's what we were put into the middle of. As it says here on the sheet, and I'm just going to go through this really quick, we're located in southeastern Ohio. We're a large farming agricultural community. We have a population of 86,000 people. Square mileage is about 680 miles. We're about the 5th largest county in square miles in the state of Ohio. Our county seat is Zanesville, and we're located about 45 minutes east of our capital, Columbus, Ohio. A little bit about me. I'm going to skip that right now. This call to this farm, we were very familiar with this farm. I've been in law enforcement since 1989. I'll have 24 years in March. And I started in Zanesville, Ohio as a deputy, came up through the ranks before I was elected sheriff, and was very familiar with Mr. Thompson, very familiar with his farm. We knew the types of animals he had there, we knew the volume, didn't know he had 56, but we knew the volume, and we knew how he kept them. Does anybody have a pet in here? A dog, cat? When you leave, do you have like a small pen that sometimes you put them in to keep them from, okay, a lot of people keep them in some so they don't tear up their house. Blow that up about 10 to 15 times. Oversized dog pens is how he kept his exotic animals. This farm started out as a rescue farm. He would travel the United States and he would bring animals that were sick or injured that were going to be euthanized or put down, and he would bring them to his farm, take possession of them, and nurse them back to health. He started breeding them and making a profit. Nobody could prove that, but that was the issue that we had. This call came in about 5 o'clock. Tomorrow is the anniversary date, in case anybody was seeing the date up there. This call came in around 5:15 p.m., and it was getting dark about 7:30. So that was one of our big problems right off the bat, was the time of call, because we only had a couple hours of daylight left to deal with this situation. The neighbors were the ones that called it in. Dolly and Sam Kopchak, I'm very familiar with them. I still play a little bit of recreational softball. They run the softball league, so I've known them forever. They've lived beside this farm for a lot of years. They look out in the pasture field. They see their horses going around in circles. They see a bear and a big cat chasing horses out in the pasture field. That's how this call came in. We were very lucky that they were home, because if they would not have been home to see what was going on, it is hard to tell how much of a head start these animals would have had on us and how far they could have traveled. My office has about 110 employees. We have 32 primary response deputies on the street. We had 6 on duty this night. That's our minimum number for afternoon shift, 3 to 11. When officers arrived out there at the location, we encountered, as it says, a wolf, a black bear, and a lion. Actually, it was a tiger as well, that were down near the road. This farm sat approximately 500 yards off the roadway. Now, I apologize for the slides. We're in the process of putting together some slides with pictures, but 5 football fields is what I estimated where this farm set from the roadway. The only thing surrounding this 77-acre farm was a pasture field fence. That's a wood split rail fence designed to keep cattle and horses in. So there were no containment fences, so to speak. When our deputies started arriving, they saw the animals down by this fence. 3 of these animals had crossed the fence and had left the pasture field. So I knew we had a terrible tragedy, terrible situation. I knew from being there that if these animals were in the pasture field, they were out of control because they were out of their pens. Again, some things I talk about. Tuesday night is when this happened. It was my only free night of the week. I had something else planned that whole week. And I just sat down with the remote control and the dog, going to look for some ESPN, and that's when my phone rang. And it says, Captain McCoke, he runs my road division. We thought when this came in that we had maybe 1 or 2 animals out. I had always thought in the back of my head that Mr. Thompson, he was very confident, kind of cocky around these animals, and he would open pen doors and throw food in there to these animals. And I always thought in the back of my head one day that one of those animals might attack him, and we might have a pen of 3 or 4 that get out that we would have to deal with. But I never dreamed he would do what he did. But having the prior knowledge of this farm really helped me in the decision that I had to make. Again, when I knew that we had these animals down by the roadway, I knew we were in trouble. No sheriff's office, there's 88 counties in the state of Ohio. None of our sheriff's offices carry tranquilizer guns. And I'm sure these guys probably have been around the tranquilizing part of it more than I have. But from the vets and the people from the zoo that I spoke to tranquilize an animal, you first have to gauge its size and weight to know how much tranquilizing agent you're supposed to give it. And I believe you're supposed to even be a vet before you start to tranquilize it. Once you tranquilize the agent, you're supposed to have some type of containment to keep it in a location to be able to monitor it. Then you're supposed to give it some type of neutralizing agent so that you don't kill it. None of those things were available to us. Magnify that with the fact that we had random animals, later on identified as 48 of them running loose, plus the fact that we only had a couple hours of daylight. That is why I made the decision to tell our people that we had to shoot these animals. The only thing on my mind was public safety. We had an apartment complex just down the road from where these animals were at. We ended up shooting 5 of these animals that were trying to get to the interstate that borders this property. We had a soccer game going on at a local high school about 2 miles down the road, and there was no way in the world that I was going to put rescued animals over top of our civilian life. And that's why I made the decision to do what we did. Again, and I'm going to skip some of this stuff just about who we called, and because a lot of this stuff I talked to PIO conferences about how we handled situations. When we got into the thing of this whole thing, we found Mr. Thompson's body on the farm. It was obvious to us from the facts and circumstances and the evidence that he had killed himself. People ask me all the time, why did he kill himself? Well, I don't like to speculate on why somebody takes their own life. There's a lot of different reasons why somebody would get to that point. But I do know that he had just recently got out of prison. He was in a prison for about a year for a federal firearms charge. His wife was not living on the farm when he got home. We think the farm had deteriorated, the animal condition had deteriorated, and at some point he got to the point where he did this. Not only did he release these animals, but he also took bolt cutters that were laying by his body and cut the cages so that they couldn't be resecured. We actually had deputies on foot eventually that were trying to put animals back in cages or secure the cages where they were sitting, and they would stick their heads out of the cut part and come out of it. So we had some very, very serious situations when we were trying to do that. One of the first things we did was started a containment plan, trying to keep the animals on the farm as much as possible. We obviously made an attempt to get to Mr. Thompson to secure his body. In the early stages, we still didn't know if he was alive, needing medical attention, and we didn't know if we had a homicide, that we had a crime scene to secure. So a lot of things were going on, and those were our first initiatives to take care Sergeant Blake was our officer in charge that night. He was the one that actually discovered Mr. Thompson when he came back down from looking for him. We actually had to put shooters in the back of a pickup truck to have the advantage and not be on foot. And that's how we got up to secure his body. We actually used volunteer fire departments and our paid fire department to bring light plants out to put on the interstate to shoot down in the field. As I said, we had 5 animals that were attempting to get up on the interstate. Our shooters were using .308 223. I use this on my presentation. I don't say it to be gung-ho backwoods macho man. The only thing we could think of worse than a loose exotic animal in our community was a wounded exotic animal in our community. We did not want to wound these animals and have them running loose in our community. We didn't know what they could have done. Same way with tranquilizing. We were afraid that if we tried, eventually once the vets got there, and I'll tell you a story in a minute about the one we did try to tranquilize, we thought if we tried to tranquilize something after dark and it got to the woods and laid down and we couldn't find it, we didn't know when it would wake up, and when it did, if we weren't right there, it could go and it would be on the loose, and we didn't want that. We canceled 2 school districts. Obviously, we didn't want kids standing at the school bus stop. You got to remember, this thing went to 11 p.m., 11:30 at night before we really had everything moving, secured that we could see. We still didn't know how many animals we had down. One of the first things we did was started an inventory list. We had 3 farm hands that were going to Mr. Thompson's house in the evenings, and they were feeding these animals. We got them together and we compiled a list, an inventory list of what they had on the farm. So that's what we were working on, because there was no legislation that said they had to have these animals registered or had to have an inventory list. So we were going into this thing blind, and we got the inventory list done and had it on file with us to be able the next day to do it. Again, secured the scene around 11:30. We had 2 deputies that stayed there in a enclosed cab ATV unit and patrolled the farm. We still hadn't collected the animals from where they had been put down, and we still had that to do. It was a very bad weather night on Tuesday night, so bad that we couldn't get a helicopter up with a FLIR unit to check for heat. We couldn't do that. It also kept the media wet. This thing got national, worldwide exposure. When I did a live interview with London, England, I knew that this thing was a lot bigger than what we anticipated. There's a lot of passion out there for exotic animals, and I think a lot of these animals that we had to shoot weren't true purebred tigers. They were crossbred. A lot of these animals would have had to have been killed before he brought them back to his farm, and a lot of them weren't treated very good. We had been there numerous times with a lot of our state agencies, but it was a situation where they weren't being starved, yet they probably just weren't being fed as much as what they would have been fed in a zoo. The black bear that was confiscated and taken to the zoo gained 65 pounds while it was in the custody of the zoo, so that tells you how little they were being fed. The next day, and I'm rushing this, I apologize, but I want to open up for questions. Located a tiger and tried to dart. As I said, I've been in law enforcement for 4 years, and on October 19th, on Wednesday, about 9:30 in the morning, I don't know that I've ever been as frightened as I was on that day in law enforcement. One of the good things about the weather was the vets and the people from the wilds. The wilds is a sanctuary that we have that is designed for people to go visit and to take bus tours to see these animals. It's on a wide open, lot of area in the southeast corner of our county, and it's an attraction, and they have a lot of the exotic animals there. When they told us the rain, if there was any animals still out there, that the rain would probably make the animals bed down because they didn't like to travel in the rain. And that's what happened. About 200 to 300 yards from the farm, in a heavy wooded area, we heard a tiger. We eventually were able to find it with the scopes on the rifles. That's the only way you could see this thing. It was in heavy, dense area. We had 9:30 a.m., so we had plenty of daylight. We had a vet with us on the site. We had a tranquilizer gun with us on the site, and we was dealing with one animal. So we made the decision, hey, let's go try to trank this cat to see if we can do the right thing. So we make the 200 to 300 yard walk down towards this animal. There was the vet, She had the rifle with the tranquilizer, myself, and 4 of my SWAT guys with rifles. We get over there, and this vet showed a lot more guts than I would. She's probably standing closer to this animal than this room is wide, and she fires the gun, and you hear the cat react with a growl. All of a sudden, within seconds, the woods start rustling. This thing gets up, starts moving right at them. I mean, just unbelievable. And our guys fired because we were afraid that the cat was coming at us. We ended up putting that cat down. But to see that reaction with everything we had going for us, and then to weigh it the night before for everything that we didn't have going for us, just kind of verified everything that we were thinking the night before. Down at the bottom, we put, the animals were buried on the property. Mrs. Thompson eventually got to that farm. She requested that the animals be buried on the property. We spoke to the health department, the Attorney General's office, my attorneys, the zoo officials, the vets. They all thought that was the most appropriate thing to do was to bury them on the property, and that's what was done. We had to keep it away from a water source, and it had to be at least 30 feet deep, and that's what they told us was the best process. Anybody know Jack Hanna? She did. You do? Okay. Yeah. Jack Hanna is widely renowned, known in Ohio, and I'm sure outside Ohio, but he was a huge asset for us, especially as PETA was brought up. We were put into a very bad situation. We were going to be scrutinized in this situation no matter what. It was a no-win for us. But I would much rather be scrutinized for what we did unless we would have hesitated and one of those animals would have killed one of our civilians or damaged a lot of livestock. I can't believe how much scrutiny we would have went through. And this situation was about not having the regulations in place to prevent somebody from having a zoo, so to speak, in his backyard. And Jack Hanna was a huge supporter of us. He'd come in, he told me the stories of him and his childhood friend in 1972 that tried to tranquilize a tiger and it attacked him and killed his friend. He told me the story of Jack having his own farm and having a small child come to his farm to visit, reaching through the fence and getting his arm ripped off. Jack had been through these things. And he drove from Penn State University throughout the night to get to our place in the morning. And as most of you probably remember, I asked him to stay there for the press conferences, and he did a lot of interviews. Don't know where we would be without Jack Hanna. Again, this is dealing with the media. Again, I do this for media too, and just talking about how we handled the media and being in the national spotlight. Again, I put on here about the aftermath. With every decision, there's going to be a chance of criticism, from one side or the other. In my position, I'm an elected official. I get my job by the voters, and we run every 4 years, just like the presidential election. And you have to have very thick skin to do a law enforcement job. Again, because you're going to be scrutinized for the decisions you make. You're put into pressure-packed situations that you have very little time to make those decisions. And again, in this decision, public safety was our main concern, our only concern. We took a lot of scrutiny. Most of that was from people out of our state that didn't have the facts and circumstances. I had phone calls from people that were saying, why did we shoot tame animals? Well, none of these animals were tame. Jack Hanna had made the statement, you can train exotics, but you can never tame them. They were saying, why did you shoot things with containment fences when they couldn't go anyplace? A split rail fence is not a containment fence. And also about the tranquilizer. And so we took a lot of scrutiny about that, but the people in our county were very supportive of us for not having anybody hurt in this situation. Again, I put on there anything different, and we talked about that for some things. So again, I usually do this in about an hour, 45 minutes. I take a lot of time to tell a couple other stories. There's a couple of funny things that happened, and the reason we're able to laugh about them now is because we were very fortunate that nobody was killed in this situation or even hurt. And I feel very lucky even to this day, almost a year later, that I still cannot believe we did not even have a report of a misfired shot that did damage to anything. And so, a little bit about the animal legislation that's happened since. I did go to the State House in Ohio to testify in front of the House of Representatives about why we needed this. and we were able to get legislation passed in the state of Ohio. It is taking a good effect. Within this last week, the county to the south of me, a lady had 4 tigers and 4 bears, and she was not going to be able to come into the compliance of the state legislation. So she called our Department of Agriculture, and they have found homes for those 8 animals, I believe, in Colorado. Just yesterday, I read an article out of the north part of Ohio where 2 tigers were being taken out because the lady was not going to be able to afford the insurance that she needed to have possession of these. They've been transported to a sanctuary somewhere, and there's 2 more out of her place that's going again. So things like that is what the legislation's for. It puts things into perspective of where you have to have permits. November 5th is a date coming up in Ohio where you have to have either your animal microchipped or registered. And if either of those 2 things are done, you can't obtain the permit needed to have that animal. And it can be confiscated from you. There's going to be insurance on those animals. There's going to be routine scheduled visits by the Department of Agriculture to make sure the conditions of the animal and the conditions of the property. There's going to be containment fences. So all those things that we didn't have. There's also going to be background checks on the people that own these animals to make sure that proper people are having them. I've stayed out of the middle of who should own exotics and who shouldn't. That's not my, that's opinion based. I have to do what I think is what the law says I have to do. So, our concern is putting things in place that this doesn't happen in another community anywhere in the United States. And that's why I go talk about our incident. So if somebody can take something from what we did and prevent this from happening. I went to Washington, D.C. The International Fund of Animal Welfare is who invited me to Washington, D.C. They are in the process of trying to prevent the breeding of the tigers. And to go on the heels of my previous speaker here, one of the problems we're seeing in Ohio and in other states is the roadside petting zoos. And what they will do is they'll breed the tigers, they'll take this, they'll wait till it gets about 8 weeks old, and I'm assuming that's so it's not susceptible to disease or contagious things. And they'll take these animals out at 8 weeks, and they'll start charging for you to come in and hold this cuddly little tiger cub. Well, at about 12 weeks, it gets a little too aggressive to be doing that. So from 8 to 12 weeks, they bilk it for all they can, and at 12 weeks, they're stuck with this tiger that's not really profitable for them. There has been articles we have found through iFall that says, advertisement free to a good home, tiger cub. That's how bad this is getting. iFall has the numbers that there are more tigers in captivity than there are in the wild. And that's the issues that we're trying to battle. So the federal legislation, there are still 6 states, and I didn't do my homework on Chicago, Illinois, but there are on Illinois, but there are 6 states that still, or 7 states that still don't have state legislation. And Ohio is being modeled maybe to adopt some of that stuff, but the federal legislation is to have something in place until the states get something, and also to help to try to curb the breeding. So again, it's like 3:08. I know we're supposed to be done at 3:15. I definitely want to open this up for questions for our panelists. And it's an honor to be here today talking about our incident. We're very fortunate nobody got hurt, and I'm open to any questions you have.
Thank you, Sheriff. All right, are there any questions for our panelists? Kelly?
My question's for the sheriff.
Yes, ma'am.
After everything you just mentioned, you said the new Ohio legislation requires people to get background checks and have to register their animals. Now, after everything you said, would you still not advocate no menageries, no roadside zoos law, and a complete ban on that?
Yeah, and again, I've kind of stayed out of the personal opinion about who should own them. I don't know why anybody would want to have one single tiger in their backyard, penned up in a dog pen, that it can't live its life. And what would you mean? Does it make you macho that you've got a tiger in your backyard? So exactly. So for me, it's a risk reward type thing that we don't need the risks of having those in our communities. And the roadside petting zoos are just that. It's a profit those people are trying to make, and then they're just taking the animals and getting rid of them, and not even caring on who they go to. So it needs to be cut out. I don't want to take away from the people that do it the right way. We have a couple places in Ohio that have sanctuaries, and I know some people don't think anybody should have them, but they do it at least the right way to make sure they're safe and to make sure they're being taken care of properly. But for me, my law enforcement opinion, we don't need them.
Other questions? Dennis?
Did any of your predecessors or you consider the possibility before this occurred, that something like that might occur at that time?
Great question, and I get that all the time. And if there's one thing that, as a sheriff, a new sheriff, I'm in my 4th year of my first term, and I'm on the ballot again this year. One of the things that I think we did is probably underestimated the popularity of exotics, and there was a task force by the governor's office that had been formed, but they just hadn't done anything on this. And we should have been more informed on that. I've got to keep reminding everybody, these animals didn't get loose, they were set free. They were turned loose with intentions of letting them out of their pens. But I never dreamed that Terry would do that. I always thought in my mind that we may have 1 or 2 or a pen of 3 or 4 get out, and we might have to deal with that, which I think we could have contained, brought tranquilizers in, and maybe dealt with 4 animals possibly. But to think that that would have happened, no. Do I fault myself for not possibly going back and doing enough to get legislation started before this incident? Yeah, but sometimes it takes a tragedy like this to kick people in the butt to get something done.
Can I ask a follow-up question? The committee of second thought a year later, could you see any way that this might have turned out differently if you had had enough equipment, tranquilizer guns, whatever it might be, that you might have been able to deal with some of those, or was there nothing you could do, absolutely nothing?
Yeah, I would not change anything on my decision. I've thought about it for about a year now, and I go around and talk to different people. If we would have had more daylight, we would have had tranquilizers and vets on the scene when it first happened and not 45 minutes to an hour later. If we would have had inventory lists to know what we were dealing with, if we'd have had the information to know how much of a head start they had and they were still contained, there could have been some things in place that you would handle this different. If there wouldn't have been a farm that had 56 of them, you could have done some things different. But I think in this situation, with everything the way it fell, no, I don't think anybody could have handled this any differently.
I was going to ask that too. Now that there's registration, so hopefully if it happens again, you do have the weight and you do have that information. Do you now have tranquilizer guns in your precinct so that if it does happen again?
No, we still have not bought tranquilizers. None of the 88 sheriffs in the state have done that. And I think the reason being is because, it's an expense. You have to keep that medicine safe. You have to replace it when it gets bad. You have to be trained in dispensing it. It's just, that is not the rule of law enforcement. And we are very fortunate that we have the Wilds, which is about 45 minutes to an hour away, and the Columbus Zoo, which is a pretty good zoo in Ohio that is 45 minutes to an hour away. So if we get one animal, we could probably contain that to have somebody bring us a tranquilizer. You had a question back here?
I was just wondering if there was, with regards to animal welfare laws, and I mean this facility is well known for being in violation of many laws, was there any visits or citations ever issued before this incident?
Great question. We had been there numerous times, and we had taken state agencies with us, Humane Department, Department of Agriculture, Health Department. And because of a lack of regulations in place, there was nothing we could do. The owner was cited for animal cruelty. I think he had wild buffalo. He had 2 wild buffalo on his property at one time and had died. And they ruled that he was animal cruelty with starvation, not feeding them. So he had been charged through our county court. But when we had been there for these exotics, so to speak, there was nothing there that the state agencies could do for us to do anything about it.
But I know it's a challenge in every department's separate, but one of the biggest challenges is getting local law enforcement to actually enforce the laws already on the books.
Correct.
Because they're, for whatever reason, it's not as high a priority.
We had been there several times and tried to do several things.
I have a question for Will. Zoos are often viewed as venues for entertainment. Do you think they have an educational and research value?
It's a very big statement to say that they all do. The bottom line is, that, in my view, that there are 10,000 zoos worldwide. They probably contain about 3 million animals. And even the AZA has carried out paper studies on the educational output of zoos and has come up inconclusive that they offer an educational benefit. In other words, that people going in on a Sunday morning come out knowing something more about animals in a true sense when they come out. And on that basis, and on the lack of the conservation dividend that zoos don't provide, I would say that a cost-benefit analysis is you've got animal suffering on a fairly gross scale, certainly deprivation if not suffering, you've got almost no education, you've got almost no conservation. There is research, but the research tends to be driven at how to keep animals in captivity to the conservation of the species in the wild. Balance that up against the needs that we have to protect animals in their natural habitat and the sort of front line of conservation. I'd say there is no question in my mind it's a complete waste of time.
Questions?
You gonna win?
What's that?
Are you going to win?
My election? I'm unopposed. Thank you.
Yes.
And my mom said she'd vote for me, so yeah, I'm unopposed.
How many times?
Well,
This is Chicago.
We have a question here.
Yeah, I was concerned about how long it took this person to accumulate 56 wild animals on his property. And also, when he went off to prison, I assume that, like, maybe the wife was living there at the time that this accumulation was happening. And then he goes off to prison and then she's left there, or does she abandon the animals as well?
good questions. You know, like I say, I started in 1989 as a 20-year-old dispatcher. I'm 44, if I was figuring that out. Yeah, they started accumulating animals and then they started breeding them. Now, there was 2 regulations in place before the new legislation. 1, they weren't supposed to be breeding them for profit. And 2, they weren't allowed to show them for profit. That was the only 2 federal regulations that we were told, and they weren't doing those 2 things. Now, supposedly, we think he was breeding and trading, but you could argue about whether that was for profit or not. But it took a while, you know, for them to accumulate those. And like I said, we were aware of the volume, but we didn't know they had got clear up to 56. What anything we could do about it. But that. The second point is that was part of the reason why he was upset when he came home. She had moved off the farm, was staying with somebody else up around the Mansfield area of Ohio. They had farm hands, 3 or 4 people that would show up at night and then they would feed the animals. She was making sure the feed was there. They had some agreements with some grocery stores that before they would throw meat into the dumpsters, they would pick it up and take it out to use it for feed on the animals. But our Columbus Zoo said that I think the figure was $250,000 a year to feed these animals is what it would cost them to do if they were fed properly.
I have a question for Greg. I kind of sense from your presentation is that you think that we expect too much of vets, that we expect them to be miracle workers. Is that a fair statement?
My view, unfortunately, is that the public really doesn't know what veterinary medicine is. As I saw, frankly, as a good summation at a veterinary school a few weeks ago, real doctors treat more than one species. But there's a significant degree of ignorance, not only in the public, but on the bench, and among the attorneys that I deal with. And I find in litigation, disciplinary proceedings, arbitration, I'm having to spend a day just doing basic education. I'm having to find, whenever I file any briefs, particularly at the beginning of the case, I have to define veterinary medical terms. And it's an educational process. My experience with veterinarians is I don't find cruel veterinarians. I really don't. The debt load that students in veterinary school come out with, on average, now in the United States, is somewhere between $185,000 and $350,000. The average pay of a new veterinarian coming out of school with that debt load is $48,000. You don't take on that commitment unless you really have an interest in taking care of animals. I've known many of them. As a matter of fact, last Saturday I was at one of my clients, and they were staying the night because of a sick animal. And that is far more common than rare exception. I find, particularly from the standpoint of professional malpractice, that we would not think for one moment that we would tolerate a layperson coming in and criticizing a physician for his or her improper handling of the case. But somehow, it's all right to just come in without having any veterinary experience at all. And then somehow this opinion of this non-veterinarian is accepted. And just to give what happened on the third day of that arbitration proceeding, the only person they put on about inadequate record keeping wasn't even a veterinarian. This was after all the evidence came out about what had happened to the computer system and the IT department frying everything. And I think at that point I got through to the arbiter, because the woman who was the human resources director, no scientific background, last scientific training was 9th grade biology, was criticizing the veterinarian. And she was of the opinion, oh, you should have given the records this way. You didn't. You should have given them to the USDA inspector this way. And the arbiter, I remember, reared back and said, what are you talking about? You're not even a veterinarian. You never use this record keeping system. You don't know anything about it. One of the problems I'm finding, and it's a criticism of, to use the phrase, the younger generation, and I will go with it. But I find that a lot of inspectors, if they cannot get all the information on board inspectors, board investigators, can't get all the information on one Excel spreadsheet, that it's not adequate record. Well, hold on here a second. Take this record, take this record, take this record. 3 pieces of information you want are here. And since it isn't on an Excel spreadsheet, we use the phrase too often in criticism of veterinarians of inadequate record keeping. Well, I'm critical of veterinarians on this, because veterinarians are the worst at saying records are inadequate. All they're really saying is, this is the way I like to keep records. I don't like the way you keep records. It's frankly easy to determine what are inadequate veterinary medical records. Go read the regulations. If the regulations say this piece of information should be in the record, and it's not there, it's a fair claim to say inadequate record. But when you have an official say, well, yeah, we know that that's all that was required, but we think this should have been in there also. Should have been in there, you should have put it in the regulation. I think also veterinarians, unfortunately, while the AVMA is very good, need to do a better job educating the public on their profession.
Thank you. Let me take one more question in the back.
Hey, hi. I have a question for Mr. Powers. So I agree with you, and I actually feel like zoos are kind of like the unsung, like Ringling Brothers almost, where it's just I don't know if you said that, you did not, but that's me. That people kind of feel endearingly towards zoos, and they don't necessarily see it for what it really is. And so I was wondering, are there ways, as we leave this conversation, where we can get involved, or where we can help to kind of advocate for, and hopefully like the amelioration of these conditions, but eventually the abolition of the zoos and keeping wild animals in captivity for entertainment? What are some things that you recommend, aside from us just like not going or patronizing those places?
Yeah, well, I think there are things that you can do. said, blind to himself. There are things that you can do. I just pick up on your point, though, about the zoos are sort of seen as, the American expression, you know, mom and apple pie, partly because your parents were taken by theirs, and they were taken by theirs, and you've been taken by yours, and why have you been taken? Because it's a, quote, good thing. It's a treat, or it's going to be educational, or it's going to be a fun day out, and it's actually quite institutionally hard to go up against an institution, the zoo world, that has been going, well, in the UK since London Zoo in 1839, you know, go up against that and criticize implicitly every single previous generation and your family. Because that's a really hard thing to do, to tilt at institutions. But I think after a nearly 200-year experiment, the experiment on balance has failed. And it's hugely it consumes a huge amount of resources, and in this very difficult time that we live in, we have to be laser sharp with the application of resources if we're going to maintain biodiversity on the planet. And zoos aren't going to play anything other than a bit part, a tiny bit part in that program. As far as what you can do, well, I mean, obviously I would say, go and look at Born Free USA's website, go and look at Born Free Foundation's website, talk to people. The worst thing you can do is say nothing. You know, whatever part of the spectrum that you're on, you know, from Gary right through to whoever else, that don't say nothing, talk to people, advocate, talk about stuff, because staying silent means you're bearing silent witness to suffering. So I think you can do something in your community. And I just wanted to pick up on one tiny last point about sanctuaries. There's a real problem with nomenclature here, and that is that the Roadside Menagerie rebrands itself and calls itself a sanctuary, and everyone goes, "What is a sanctuary? All they do is rescue animals. It must be okay." It's just as deregulated or unregulated as the Roadside Menagerie was, but it sort of feels more cozy and comfy. And all I would say is, if the sanctuary in your area isn't a GFAS sanctuary, the Global Federation of Animal Sanctuaries accredited facility, which is going to be the global standard for sanctuaries, where you can guarantee that the standards that the animals are kept in are good, and that the business plan behind it means that you don't end up with that kind of collapse, all the animals are going to die, send us your money syndrome, which is also something we're all too familiar with. Make sure it's a GFAS accredited sanctuary. There's a website, of course, which you can go to.
All right, thank you so much to our speakers.
Don't be taken in by hearing the word rescuer. Sounds good, warm and cozy. This person must be a good person. Unfortunately now, a lot of rescuers are really animal hoarders. And you've got to watch this. Because all you're doing when a so-called rescuer comes in to, quote, rescue animals, where are those animals in fact ending out? Are they really ending out with a humane animal organization, or are they just ending out with a hoarder or group of hoarders? So be very careful. Just hearing the word rescuer does not mean that that is a good person.
All right, we'll take about a 10-minute break and come back for our last panel.